All right, guys, here is our third video for this week, and we are continuing. This is part two of Ike's Conservatism, Conformity, and Consumerism. So, yesterday we were talking about um, Joe and Rosie versus Jenny and Forrest. So, Jenny and Forrest are going to have a very distinct culture that is going to be in conflict with Joe and Rosie. So this is going to be reflected not only in the gender roles that we looked at yesterday, but also in patriotism. So Joe and Rosie, remember, they're part of that World War II generation who sacrificed and died for the United States, that American cause. And they're going to be very patriotic. And a lot of the television shows that are on at the time, and realize that television is the new medium of the 1950s, where in the 1920s it was about radio. But in the 1950s, television. And so a lot of the television shows will reflect their values. For example, we have here we have here Davy Crockett, and this was frontier culture, rugged individualism. Same thing with the Lone Ranger. Again, the Western frontier, that patriotic, something that is uniquely American, the frontier. We also have as very patriotic the television show. So, Truth, Justice, and the American Way. Superman was another major television show that was on at the time, reflecting Joe and Rosie's values. And we do see, because this was largely predominantly white, middle class, and suburban, I Love Lucy also reflected those values. And look at the gender roles here. They're often reflected. Lucy stays home, takes care of the kids, while Ricky goes to work. This was another Gunsmoke. Again, there were a lot of westerns during the 1950s, again reflecting that culture. All right, now let's switch gears and let's go to the teen culture. So Jenny and Forrest are going to value something very different than Joe and Rosie. Their culture is going to reflect a little bit of angst, a little bit of rebellion, right, against the traditional values of Joe and Rosie. Remember, I told you they grew up watching these television shows. These teens grew up watching television shows that reflected families that were absolutely perfect, and of course, no family is like that. And so, they started to question these traditional values as a result. And so by the time they became teenagers, they're full on into rebellion mode. Even the word teenager wasn't even part of our vocabulary until the 1950s, which is when it entered the American language. All right, so let's talk about music first. So is going to become a big industry in the 1950s because let's think about it. Jenny and Forrest are the largest generation ever, and they have money. So you have numbers and you have dollars. So the music industry is going to capitalize this because they could produce these vinyl records, often referred to as LPs or 45s, and they could make them dirt cheap, but then sell them to this group of teens who have a dispensable income. And so music became this became a big business. And what kind of music did Jenny and Forrest like? Well, definitely not Joe and Rosie's type music. They liked the taboo music, that music coming out of African American community that was largely born in the Harlem Renaissance. And that was a lot of rhythm and blues type music, a lot of high energy, danceable type music. And so music that was, yes, predominantly African American. For example, here is an example of that black music that Jenny and Forrest tended to love. So again, here we see that kind of really high energy type of dance music that Jenny and Forrest really liked. The problem is that they couldn't listen to it. It was taboo. But then coming into popularity largely because he was white, but essentially played black music was Elvis Presley. So Elvis Presley is going to incorporate that type of high energy rhythm and blues type music, but it's going to appeal to a white audience because Elvis Presley was white. So Jenny and Forrest loved this kind of music. Here's a little sampling from Elvis Presley. So this is the kind of stuff that Jenny and Forrest loved to buy, and it kind of reflected this juvenile delinquency, this greaser mentality, right? That Elvis Presley bought. Now, at first, Jenny and Forrest got away with liking Elvis Presley until television showed Elvis Presley dancing. Then Joe and Rosie were like, oh no. But that just made Jenny and Forrest love Elvis and that type of music even more. So, juvenile delinquency was kind of the value that we see embraced by our teen culture. And this is going to be reflected in a lot of movies, such as James Dean's Rebel Without a Cause and Marlon Brando's The Wild One. Even in literature, we see this angst, right? Becoming very popular is The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. And he had a cult following. He was so popular that he became reclusive because turns out he was kind of a recluse, but his popularity in The Catcher in the Rye made him kind of an icon. And this was a story about a teen who was angsty and angry. And of course, it was put often on the censors list in schools because Joe and Rosie did not approve. But again, this is the kind of stuff that our teens, our Jenny and Forrest, listen to. Let's take a little sampling here of what Joe and Rosie wanted Jenny and Forrest to hear. This music is going to reflect kind of that waltzy type of dance that we see by Joe and Rosie. And this was a popular song. Alrighty. So let's move now to another group of angsty teens, and this is known as the beatnik culture, um, or the beatniks. And so this particular group of boomers, right, were a little bit older. They tended to be more college age, and they were also critics of American society and traditional American values. They often were young poets, writers, artists. I like to call them the hipsters of the 1950s because they wore berets and they smoked cigarettes and they snapped their fingers in applause. So, the guru of this movement was Allen Ginsberg. He wrote a poem called Howl that became essentially the anthem to the teen culture. Also, reaching heroic status was Jack Kerouac. He did what Henry David Thoreau talked about in his book Walden, just separate himself from traditional society. And so Jack Kerouac quite literally left society and went on the road on his motorcycle, kind of touring Route 66 and divorcing himself from traditional American culture. And he wrote about his experiences on the road in the book On the Road. And so Jack Kerouac became kind of a hero for the beatniks. You may recognize this song, also a beatnik, who wrote in the 1950s and 60s, and you'll probably be familiar with this guy. So, Bob Dylan was essentially a beatnik who wrote about the generational divide between Joe and Rosie and Jenny and Forrest. Just basically, here's this Forrest talking to Joe and saying these times, they are a changing, reflecting the divide generationally between these two groups. So let's now switch gears to back to Joe and Rosie. So, of course, Joe and Rosie are looking at their kids and going, oh my God, they're all going to hell. So, we're going to start to see a fourth great awakening. So, let's kind of play review a little bit and talk about our four great awakenings. So, the first one, remember, was in period one and two. It was in the early 1700s, around 1730. And basically, this was because we were isolated and scattered in colonies, and this was in colonial America, that we didn't need organized churches. So go commune in nature and have your personal relationship with God in order to be saved. Then we also saw the Second Great Awakening. That was in period four, and that was in the early 1800s. And so in this time, remember, the Second Great Awakening was in reaction to the market revolution and all the changes associated with an industrializing culture. And so this particular movement, the Second Great Awakening, said, let's go back to an organized church to find comfort and security there. Then we talked about the Third Great Awakening in the 1920s. This was in reaction to World War I and the Spanish influenza. And in this particular third Great Awakening in the 1920s, y'all remember Billy Sunday and Amy McPherson embracing those conservative type values, progressivism. I'm sorry, versus progressivism in prohibition and that kind of stuff. So, again, the third Great Awakening. And now in the 1950s, a fourth Great Awakening. So, this was in reaction to the generational divide between Jenny and Forrest and Joe and Rosie. And you'll notice that I'll be making a lot of parallels between the 1920s and the 1950s. So, our fourth Great Awakening, this religious revival that's going to take place um, in the 1950s, and we're going to see Joe and Rosie reflecting this idea of conservatism. And so, the under God was placed in the Pledge of Allegiance. In God we trust on the dollar bill. So we'll see that there was a revival. Reverend Billy Graham, you may have heard of him. He started having TV type shows in which he would preach these messages warning against um, the provocativeness of American society that was embraced by Jenny and Forrest, as well as the evils of communism. Remember, we're all freaked out about the communists as well. So movies tended to reflect a lot of Joe and Rosie's values. We have the robe, the Ten Commandments, Ben Hur, as part of some of the big epic movies that were coming out, all Bible based and religious. All right, technology. So let's move towards technology. So there's been some technological progress that's going to take place. That's going to contribute to the economic boom of the 1950s. So let's look at computing. So we did see some rudimentary computers happening in the 1920s, and then this will be greatly uh, uh, improved in World War II. Y'all remember the Ultra Project and the Magic Project. These all used in deciphering those codes, all use computing. So, so the 1950s, we're starting to see for the first time data processing devices used by businesses and other organizations. The first significant computer of the 1950s was the Universal Automatic Computer, which was developed largely for the government to kind of data process all of the information collected by the census. And it was created by the Remington Rand company. And so I don't know if you all realize this, but computers were basically the size of rooms, and only businesses and government used computers. Personal computers or PCs really didn't come into Americans' lives until the 1980s. And that's just the introduction. Most people didn't own a computer until the 2000s. All right, so other technologies with our fascination with technology. We're going to start to see this reflected in the rise of science fiction. Bombs, rockets, missiles, right? These were all part of our American vernacular now. And this is going to be reflected in a lot of science fiction, whether it's movies or literature. So, the 1950s, we know the US successfully detonated the first hydrogen bomb. And this was a much more powerful bomb than the atomic bomb. And so, because of all of these testing, nuclear testing, you all knew that in Nevada, as well as other parts of the American Southwest, we did have nuclear testing facilities. And so, Area 51, all of these types of top secret areas. And yes, there were testing a lot of technologies, including new types of planes like the U-2 spy plane and all this kind of stuff. So UFO sightings skyrocketed in the 1950s. People saw things in the skies they never used to see, and they were unexplained. So uh, UFO meaning unexplained, right? A flying object. So these things started to increase. And of course, it's just going to stoke the flames of paranoia. Hollywood is going to capitalize this with these B movies that reflected this trend in culture. So, Forbidden Planet, Invaders from Mars, and War of the Worlds. So, you all remember the War of the Worlds radio address where everybody thought it was legitimately real and went and freaked out. So, all of these particular movies actually had an underlying theme. Usually, the alien that was part of these B Hollywood movies, the alien often was code for Soviet. All right, some medical breakthroughs were happening. Antibiotics and vaccines, they're starting to enter mainstream society. We've had these things for a while, but having most Americans having access to these things is happening in the 1950s. Why? Because we are a middle class culture that is embracing Dr. Benjamin Spock, saying, yes, we should universally vaccinate all of our children. So we're seeing a lot of accessibility in medicine to the American public. So let's just move on from here. I will mention, I guess I'll stop and mention this one. So Jonas Salk introduced an effective vaccine against polio. And I only mention this because of our current situation with corona. So people often avoided going out in public because of polio outbreaks. Polio was pretty crippling uh, disease that you would catch. It was very contagious, so very contagious that oftentimes theme parks and public gatherings would be canceled due to outbreaks, and this would attack the nervous system. So essentially, you became it affected your nervous system. So sometimes it would result in paralysis. So this was another freak out we were having, with epidemics. And Jonas Salk introduced an effective vaccine against polio. So kids started getting vaccinated against polio, and people's fears started to alleviate. Our life expectancy went up as a result. I'm going to end this frame talking about technology and politics. So, as we said before, the Soviet Union, um, with the death of Stalin, elevated as their face of the Soviet Union Nikita Khrushchev, and you can see him here. And in 1959, the Soviet Union hosted a an exhibit in Moscow, and at one of the exhibits, the Americans hosted a an exhibit in this kind of like a World's Fair kind of exhibit in Moscow called the American National Exhibit. And in it, we put a typical American kitchen. And so in this kitchen, of course, are all these new fancy appliances and all of these things. And what we touted was that this is what typical Americans have, your middle class Americans, and this is what democracy and this is what capitalism could bring to you to countries. And so Richard Nixon, who at the time was vice president to Eisenhower, was on a diplomatic mission and he went to Moscow, attended the American National Exhibit, invited the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to meet him there, where they would, debate the merits of communism versus capitalism. And of course, this was covered by the press, and it really did emphasize what middle class Americans have. So it's known as the kitchen debates. So Nikita Khrushchev and Richard Nixon. All right, so keep up with those frames. Stay safe, and the next video should be coming in the next day or so. Signing off.